February 18th, 1944, Attu Island. A flashlight cut a thin, trembling column through a night that sounded like it was trying to break itself apart. Wind came at the men sideways, hard enough to lift the brim of a helmet and pour knives of snow under coat collars. The beam found wood splinters first, then the bent curve of a metal door. For a moment, the world held only the rasp of breath and the light, and then the beam fell upon eyes, many of them, reflecting back like dull coins in the dark. They expected enemy fighters. What stared back at them was not a firing line, but a heap of bodies, faces turned up to the doorway, thinness like a map of hunger etched into cheeks. Steam rose from the opening in faint, ghostly whirls, and wherever the light touched, there was the quick, wet shine of human breath. A small voice, halting and fierce, came through the gloom. "We are nurses. Please, mercy." If you value forgotten acts of courage, like and subscribe to help keep them alive. The men on that patrol were not a relief column or a hospital unit. They were a four-man demolition detail, sent ahead of the main force with picks, explosives, and a mission: clear obstacles, find intelligence, and move on. The island had been scarred by weeks of fighting. Attu had been a remote place turned into a battlefield, an island far from home, where weather could be as lethal as any bullet. The Americans called their campaign to retake the Aleutians Operation Land Crab. It was a fight through cold, fog, and a stubborn enemy that had fortified the high ground and made every ridge an argument to be won. The landscape had already swallowed men who froze on slopes or died in shell-blown gullies. Bodies lay half-buried in drifts, helmets poked like ruined moons. Why nurses were on the island, why they had been left in bunkers that were now collapsing under snow and shell fire, was not fully clear to everyone who later told the story. Some accounts hinted at confusion and chaos in the retreat, at units cut off during withdrawal. Other memories suggested the women had been sheltering in place with wounded. Whether they had been intentionally abandoned or simply stranded amid the fog of war remained indefined. What was indisputable was the scene in front of the Americans now. 15 living, fragile, and dying figures pressed together in a heap of rail-thin bodies beneath a storm-scarred roof. The first two men to crouch at the mouth of the bunker were Corporal James William and Sergeant Davis. Private Chun, who could speak some Japanese, stayed a step back with his rifle slung, and Private Kowalski, younger than the rest, kept his hands where they could be seen. William's flashlight washed across a face near the door. At first, it was only a pair of closed eyes, eyelashes crusted with frost. Then a hand moved, fingers like a few dry branches, and a shadow of a bough as someone inside tried to sit up. The bunker smelled of stale breath and old bandages, of metal and the faint, sweet rot of melting snow. Yuki stepped forward as if she were making a ceremony of the moment. She was not young by the standards of a nurse. She moved with a steadiness that made the light seem to slow. She bowed, a small, exact motion, and then, with English broken but clear, she said, "We are nurses. Please, mercy." The words were not a plea for clemency from an enemy so much as an urgent announcement of what they were, caregivers who had run out of the tools that made them such. For a long second there was only the wind and the click of a boot on frozen timber. The team had a choice. The rules of small unit survival in a hostile, frigid place pushed toward expedience. Leave what cannot be carried, move fast, avoid getting stuck where a storm can bury you by nightfall. They were light on manpower and heavy on explosives. 15 more mouths to feed, 15 more bodies to shield while a blizzard came crawling in. It was, by many calculations, madness. Davis glanced at William. His face was carved by winters and war. He had seen enough to know when the terrain would decide a man's fate faster than a rifle. "We can mark the spot, tie a red ribbon," he said quietly, the solution of a man trained to prioritize the mission. "Get the main column to sweep back." William felt the wind claw at the back of his neck. He thought of Ohio, of a house that might never have his name again, of simple things not yet promised to him, a street with maple trees, a daughter's laugh he had not heard. Those private thoughts were useless in the glare of the flashlight. He said, "We don't leave them here." Chun stepped forward and crouched near the nearest figure. With a few halting phrases, he coaxed names and nods and learned what he could in the broken, clipped syllables Yuki and the others managed. They were nurses with a discipline that still kept them arranged in order, the weakest in the center, the strongest on the outside. Yuki would not allow panic. She moved like a captain among her charges, checking shoulders, adjusting blankets that were barely blankets at all. Her voice was small but exact. "We survived together," she said, not a statement of past action only, but as a creed that might be kept if someone willing intervened. There was also a calculation about the storm. They had perhaps 2 hours before the weather swallowed the island whole. That was what Davis thought. That was what training drilled into them. Time, weather, distance. The decision hardened in the cold like a snapped branch. William made it with a nod that had no drama to it. It was the workman's way of choosing. They would attempt to bring the women out. There was no law written against risking your life for a stranger in a collapsed bunker. War made odd laws. They gathered what they could: a bellowing jeep with a makeshift sled, a length of rope, strips of canvas to be used as stretchers, a handful of hard biscuits, an emergency can of chocolate that tasted like melted coal but gave heat. The men worked quickly, the motion small and brutal: lift, slide, bind. The nurses were wrapped in cedar blankets and bundled like bundles of wood. When someone tried to protest, Yuki's hand rested steady on an arm and squeezed in a gesture that said, wordlessly, that the woman had surrendered to what was necessary. They tied a rope to the sled and to one another. The rope would be the lifeline, a human chain through white knives of wind. Each man took his place, counting on the rope to keep them from vanishing into drifts or sliding down slopes where a fall might mean never being found. The patrol moved into the night with the load that would make any seasoned soldier measure the risk on his tongue. The first steps were slow, the snow giving under boots with the hollow, wet sound of trapped breath. The first few hundred yards were manageable. The sky was a low smudge of cloud. The moon was a pale, watery eye. The battered trees, the broken stones, the shell-blasted ground turned into a landscape of obstacles that searched for the unwary. The stretcher-bearers found their rhythm: one step, another, lean, brace, a whistle of breath, the whisper of leather on fabric. At times a nurse would murmur, the sound muffled by scarves, a name, a prayer, a memory. Yuki kept her face pressed to the slope, eyes on the way. The weather remembered the wounded. The storm arrived like a thing with teeth. The wind thickened and began to throw itself not at their backs, but at their faces, hot with cold. Snow became bone dust in their mouths. Ice gathered at the lashes and then cracked into flakes on cheeks. A soldier's breath turned into a thin white flag, and with every step the night seemed to push them backward. Distance that had been measured in minutes stretched into hours. The men tightened their hold on the rope. When Kowalski faltered, they felt it in the rope before they saw anything. He was young enough that his voice came out as a surprised noise first, rather than a curse. One moment he was keeping pace. The next, his boots lost bite on a slope of glazed snow, and he went down, the stretcher lurching and the rope going taut. William hauled his weight and felt a sharp zing of pain in the shoulder where the lines pulled. Chun yanked downward, using his body as a counterweight. Kowalski's fingers were white with cold and slipping. Someone had to lean, to crawl out and forge a handhold with frozen palms. Davis barked orders that were less about tactics and more about keeping heartbeats steady. "Watch your toes. Keep the rope tight. Don't stop." They pulled Kowalski up and bound a length of canvas around his chest to keep him warm. For a moment, William thought that heat could be a dividing line between life and something else. He thought of how thin a margin can be. Hypothermia was a thief with a gentle voice. Some of the nurses' hands were already mottled, blackened at the tips. The men rubbed fingers too numb to know if they were helping. One of the nurses stopped shivering and went very still, as if she were listening to the storm rather than to the men. Yuki leaned over her and said something in Japanese that had the same cadence as a lullaby and a command. She pressed a piece of hard biscuit to the woman's lips. There was no dramatic recovery, only the subtle shift of a lost heat, finding a skeleton of life and beginning to move again. They pressed forward because withdrawal would condemn the women to the dark. That decision created its own moral weather. For every meter gained, the men laid down the gamble that they might be found or might not. They traded small things like chocolate and a cigarette, the kind of unfair barter that in war becomes a currency of humanity. The soldiers were careful with their words because sentiment was a kind of fuel that could be wasted. But there were moments when a hand would pause on a rib cage just to feel that the strange shape of a human being made the same small noises theirs did. Yuki's authority never waned. She spoke quietly to those she could steady and shouted when she needed to get a man to his feet. There was a clear hierarchy inside the bunker's fallen roof. She was the one who knew who could be moved and who needed to be left longer still. When William hesitated over a woman whose breath had grown very shallow, she leaned close and said, with a face that was all clarity and no pity, "We survived together." The words were an appeal and a promise. William understood them in a way that made the decision simple. They would not break the chain. Everything that could go wrong did. The rope froze, rivets of ice snapped in the throes of wind, and a sled runner caught on a hidden root. At one point, the stretcher caught on an outcropping, and one of the nurses was jerked, sliding her face against the snow. She did not cry out with pain. She simply blinked white flakes from her lashes and clutched the canvas with a strength that seemed more than she could muster. William had to bite his lip to stop a sound from escaping. There was so little left to do but haul and hope. At another time, a line of shell fire picked up some pieces of the ridge, and the men had to lie flat while shells sang over their heads. It was a reminder that the island had not given them a respite. Violence still threaded through the weather. The rescuers moved in bursts. Get low, creep forward, close your eyes to the flash, and count the seconds until silence returned. Sometimes the silence was worse than the noise because it left the wind alone to stage its assaults. The climax felt like a long one.
Kowalski's breathing thinned. His teeth had silvered with ice. One by one, the men felt their muscles give out on the steep sections. At a slope where the ground fell away, William had to anchor himself beneath a boulder and use both arms to keep the sled from toppling. You could name every reason to stop and save those reasons for when you wanted to be sensible. None of those reasons made a dent on the men's resolve. Yuki, too, was near collapse, but she refused to be put on a stretcher. She refused to be carried while others were left to die. Her eyes were a map of things gone through, and she sharpened them at every halt with a look that would not be argued. There was a moment when one nurse's body went limp and felt like a stone beneath the patchwork of blankets. Her breaths were tiny, and Chun turned her face toward him with hands numb enough to be a danger. He caught her eyelids and saw a flicker. He fed her a sliver of chocolate, and she swallowed by someone's measure of strength. Yuki's voice was a thread in the cold air. Hold her. Do not let go. Simple orders that cut through the chaos and gave the men a way to keep moving. They made the last miles like people carrying a secret that was too big to be true, that mercy could be the choice even in a place designed to kill. The supply depot was an imagined thing at first, a rumor filed under hopeful thinking, but then its silhouette took shape through the snow, a cluster of canvas and wood, a collection of men moving like shadows. There were lamps, a warm rumble of motors, the smell of fuel and hot metal. Medics were there with blankets and stretchers, with hands that had more training than the four-man patrol's improvisations. The sight of them felt like a closing of a gap between two spinning worlds. When the medics took over, it was not an end to worry, but the relief of having passed a burden into more precise hands. Nurses were moved to heated tents. Some cried at the first warmth that hit their bones. One medic whispered to another, a professional murmur of triage and treatment. Yuki stood with her back straight while a medic checked pulses. The wind had not yet learned to be kind. She watched the hands that had saved her charges, and then found William among the crowd. Their eyes met across a thin wash of steam and canvas. The complexity of the moment hung in the cold air. Exhaustion, gratitude, the dark knowledge that life is a ledger always in flux. "She lives," Yuki said to William, in a voice that had the crack of someone who had been staring into dark wells and finding a way out. "You saved her." It was both an affirmation and a benediction. The men muttered things that tried to be modest about what they had done. William felt foolish at his own small talk. There was no trumpet, no grand salute. The applause of war is often muted. The reward was in the sight of chests that rose again, of eyelids that opened to a light that was not the flashlight's beam.
Not all of the nurses survived. That was a truth both ugly and simple. It did not need picture or flourish. Some were beyond what makes for recovery, in a place where even the best field hospitals had their limits. But several recovered enough to be moved to fuller care, and records later would place some of them in the hands of medics until plans could be made to return them, in whatever manner history allowed, to their own as events permitted. Years later, when war had been reduced to dates and photographs and the strange ways memory distilled things, Yuki found William again. She crossed an ocean and a lifetime to present herself at his door, not as an officer of state, but as a woman who had once been carried out of a bunker on a sled. They spoke in a mix of halting phrases and much that passed between silences. She told him about small recoveries, about what it meant to watch a patient breathe again and then to sleep. William, who had kept a stubborn portion of his life tied to that night, listened as if the wind itself were recounting a story. At her death, William went to her grave. He folded an origami crane from paper that had once come wrapped around a chocolate bar they had shared on the march. The crane was not a thing meant for words. Its wings were a small prayer. He set it on a stone with hands that had been steadier in storms and in their aftermath. The gesture was private and simple, a fragile emblem of the persistence of human ties across the ruptures of war. The rescue on Attu was, in its way, an unbelievable thing because it violated all the tidy categories war insists upon. Enemy and ally became two sets of lungs in the same bitter air. Discipline and impulse braided together into a single action. The men on that patrol had nothing to gain by risking their lives for those they were told to see as the other. They had everything to lose. They did it anyway. There are stories of war that focus on strategy and maps, on units and positions, on the names of operations that read like military shorthand. There is a place for those stories. but sometimes a single small choice, a decision to unbolt a door and follow a beam of light that finds not fighters but hands, tells us something truer about what people can do when the world collapses around them. It is not a tale of heroism for a billboard. It is a record of a human hour, a flashlight, steam rising from a desperate mouth, a rope looped in the snow, a woman who will not be left, and the men who chose to carry her. This rescue was not a miracle in the sense of a thunderbolt from a just heaven. It was the product of choices made inside a storm, of leadership that crossed language and uniform and, at the barest level, acknowledged another person's claim on life. It was also a reminder that the cold does not care for armies. It simply takes what is exposed.
What saves someone in that kind of place is small, stubborn decision-making. Tie the rope, share the chocolate, keep the fingers from letting go. Years later, the paper crane at Yuki's grave was a small symbol of that stubbornness. William used to say that the face he had seen in the bunker, the face that had bowed and said, "We are nurses, please, mercy," was stamped into him the way frost stamps a pattern into glass. The memory did not fade into heroic thumbnails. It stayed, like a scar that makes you move differently. He would sometimes tell the story quietly to new recruits, not to preach, but to ask them to remember that there are moments when the mission changes from taking ground to saving those who cannot move. If this story moved you, share it and tell us where you're watching from. Help us remember these moments. There are other questions that never vanish from the margins of the tale. What became of every name in the bunker is in some cases unknown, because war keeps records like a lantern in fog, scattered, partial, sometimes lost. Whether the women had been left deliberately or were simply victims of the disorder and speed of retreat is a matter historians still sort through. Parts of that history remain indefinable. What is not in doubt is that a group of U.S. soldiers found human beings who had been reduced almost to nothing by cold and hunger and chose to haul them, rope by rope, back toward warmth. In the end, the story does not belong to a single side. It belongs to the people who decided to do the right thing under conditions that rewarded practicality with survival. It belongs to Yuki, who would not leave her charges and whose discipline kept a thin line of humanity intact. It belongs to James William and Sergeant Davis and Private Chun and Private Kowalski, who bound themselves to a rope and to a promise made in the dark. And it belongs to the nurses, many of whom never told their stories with pride so much as with a quiet sense of having been held when they were too weak to hold themselves. War leaves strange heirlooms, a folded piece of paper, a scar, an old photograph with frost blotted along the edge. The rescue on Attu left its own relics, minutes and decisions and a few lives that otherwise might not have continued. It also left something else, harder to store in museums, an example that human kindness can insist itself even amid orders and explosions and weather that does not answer to human plans. Death is easy, living is hard, Yuki said once, years after the snow had drifted and the island had grown quiet. It was not an elegy sung at a funeral, but a statement about the work that follows survival. Living means the long repair of body and memory and home and dignity. For those the men had carried, the trouble of being alive did not end when they were put into warm blankets. It only began again in different rooms, under different lights.
The men who carried them understood that the rescue, the act itself, was only the first step in a longer moral accounting. The photograph of William with his hands folded around the paper crane surfaced years after his death. It was a simple image, a man older than the one on the battlefield, eyes that had learned not to expect much of fate, fingers folded over the delicate wings of the crane. People sometimes ask why men do such things in war, why they risk themselves for those they might have been taught to see as simply the enemy. The answer, as plain as the snow, is that there are moments when human beings are not defined by flags or orders, but by what they choose to do for one another. The story of those 15 nurses and the 4 men who chose to save them is not a neat parable. It is ragged and human. It is also, in its way, unbelievable, because it fills a space where one might expect only strategy and brutality with an act of compassion that refused to be practical. It is a story to remember not because it proves war noble, but because it proves people are capable of small, luminous choices, even when the ground itself tries to take everything. Remember them. Share this story. Tell someone where you heard it from, and keep the names Yuki, James William, Davis, Chun, Kowalski from slipping into the kind of forgetfulness battlefields cultivate. There are too many of these moments left untold, and in telling them, we do something modest but necessary. We recognize that the past was made of persons, not just operations, that mercy found its way into a bunker on Attu Island on a night that might otherwise have been entirely consumed by winter and war.